It was around 10 in the morning on the 18th of March 1944. A 26-year-old Finnish soldier named Imo Koivunen was sitting around a small campfire with the other men in his squadron. They were deep inside the Arctic Circle, in a dense forest in northern Europe that was buried under several feet of snow. The air was frigid, hovering around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Amo was carefully melting a pot of snow over the flames so the group could have some hot tea. And even though it was a quiet moment, Amo's entire body was aching. This was the first time he and the other soldiers had stopped to rest in nearly 2 full days. They had been on the move constantly, and the exhaustion was setting in deep. Amo and his squadron were part of the Finnish military. At this point in World War II, Finland found itself in a complicated alliance with Nazi Germany. It wasn't because they shared an ideology. It was because they shared a powerful enemy, the Soviet Union. Right now, Amo's group was in a region called Lapland. This area had once belonged to Finland, but 4 years earlier, the Soviets had invaded and forced Finland to give up the territory. Now, with the larger war raging, Finland saw a chance to reclaim their land, and Germany was helping them do it. So Amo and his squadron were on what was basically a reconnaissance mission. Their job was to ski through this part of Lapland and find out what the Soviets were up to, how many of them were out there, and where they were based. For the past 2 days, they had skied all over their designated area of operations. But so far, they hadn't seen a single Soviet soldier. Not one. They hadn't found any Soviet bases either. And for Amo, and probably for the other men with him, this was a good thing. They were all trained for combat, of course, but that didn't mean they were eager to get into a firefight. The Soviet military was bigger, better equipped, and more advanced. If it came down to a real battle out here in the middle of nowhere, there was no telling how it would end. So, as Amo sat there, sore and tired, watching the snow slowly turn to water, he felt a sense of relief. He was grateful that their mission had turned out to be so quiet and uneventful. But then, just as the water in the pot began to boil, the calm was shattered. The unmistakable sound of machine gun fire erupted from somewhere very close by. Instantly, Amo and the others jumped to their feet. They dropped what they were doing and frantically scanned the trees, trying to pinpoint where the shooting was coming from. Before they could even get their bearings, Amo's lieutenant started shouting orders, telling them to grab their weapons and get ready. They all scrambled for their guns. Amo snatched his rifle, and as he looked up, he saw them. Off in the distance, maybe a quarter of a mile away, an entire pack of Soviet soldiers was bearing down on them. They were on skis, gliding down a nearby mountainside, and their machine guns were blazing. They weren't firing warning shots. They were firing directly at Amo and his men. There was no question about it. They were under attack. Now, Amo and the other Finnish soldiers had been trained for exactly this kind of situation. This was their job. They were soldiers. But for a brief moment, as Amo saw the sheer number of Soviet troops descending on their small group, a wave of pure terror washed over him. They were hopelessly outnumbered. He knew, in that instant, that this was going to end badly. His mind flashed to his family. He was the oldest of 6 children. When he had first enlisted, he had made a promise to all his younger siblings. He told them he wouldn't get hurt. He promised he would come home safe. And now, looking at the scene unfolding in front of him, he was certain he was about to break that promise. He was going to die out here in the snow. He glanced over at his lieutenant, who looked just as terrified as he felt. But the officer quickly composed himself. He barked out the only order that made sense: flee. Just moments later, Amo and his men were on their skis, pushing off as hard as they could, skiing away from the Soviets down the other side of the mountain. It was a desperate race for survival. As Amo skied, he could hear the distinct sound of bullets whizzing past his head. He heard them thudding into the trees all around him. He just kept thinking, at any second, one of those bullets is going to find me, or one of my friends. There was nothing they could do but just go. Go as fast and as far as they possibly could. Amo was a strong skier, and he found himself at the front of their fleeing formation. He was leading the pack. This meant it was his job to cut the first tracks through the deep, fresh snow, making it a little easier for the soldiers behind him to follow. But it was incredibly draining work. He was expending a huge amount of energy plowing a path while being shot at. As much as he wanted to stay in the lead and help his teammates, his body was starting to fail him. The initial adrenaline rush you get in a combat situation is unbelievably intense, but it can also lead to a massive crash. It was like his body had burned through all its fuel at once. He had this huge burst of energy, and now he felt like he was collapsing even as the danger was getting closer. His body just couldn't go any faster. He felt himself slowing down. His teammates started zipping past him. They couldn't stop for him. They couldn't even slow down. The bullets were flying. Their only hope was to keep moving. Amo knew that if he couldn't keep up, he was dead. But his muscles were screaming. He was slowing down more and more. The sound of the gunfire was getting louder, closer. He thought about his siblings again, about how devastated they would be when they got the news that he had been killed. Slower and slower he went. The last of his teammates passed him, disappearing down the mountain into a white abyss. And then he was alone. Finally, he lost control of his skis completely. He veered off to the side, started tumbling down the mountain, and smashed hard into a tree. Everything went black. When Amo woke up, it was light outside. He had no idea how much time had passed. He also had no idea how he was still alive. Did the Soviets just miss him? Did they decide not to finish him off? What happened to his teammates? He had so many questions. But alongside the confusion, he felt something else, something very distinct. He had this immense sense of alertness. He was hyper-alert, more aware than he had ever been in his entire life. It was as if his senses were dialed up to 10. He could hear every rustle of the wind, see every detail in the snow around him. He felt totally, completely aware of his surroundings. With this newfound hypervigilance, he started to take stock of his situation. The first thing he noticed was that he was alone. The Soviets were gone. He wasn't a prisoner. His comrades were also nowhere to be seen. He was completely alone in the wilderness of the Arctic Circle. But then he saw his skis lying nearby. He still had his boots on. Most of his equipment was scattered around him, but it was there. He even found his compass, which he had been holding in his hand. He still had a way to navigate, and he still had his rifle. He thought to himself, okay, the situation is bad, but I have the tools I need to survive for a while. And then he realized something truly amazing. Despite having crashed and smashed into a tree, he didn't feel any pain. He checked his body over. He didn't seem to have any injuries at all. It felt like a miracle. The worst thing that had happened was that he was lost and abandoned. But it could have been so much worse. Amo eventually pushed himself up to his feet. He looked off into the distance, and there, maybe 6 or 7 miles away, he saw a plume of smoke rising from a mountain. He recognized that mountain immediately. It was the designated rendezvous point for his squadron, the place they were supposed to go if they ever got separated. Hope surged through him. He looked at the smoke, a clear sign of life, and thought, that's them. Those are my teammates. They made it to the rendezvous point. All I have to do is get to that mountain. So, Amo gathered his backpack, picked up his gun, and put on his skis. He started skiing towards the distant mountain. For a long time, he just kept his eyes locked on that column of smoke, making sure he was heading in the right direction. As he got closer, he became more and more certain. In addition to the smoke, he could now make out what looked like small lean-to tents on the mountainside. That was a telltale sign. That's how Finnish soldiers set up their camps. This was it. He was going to be saved. He just had to get there. And he felt this incredible surge of energy. Maybe it was the relief of knowing he was close to being rescued, but it felt like nothing could make him tired. Finally, Amo got close enough to the campsite that he could actually see faces. He could see the other soldiers. And they were his comrades. They were Finnish soldiers. They had made it to the rendezvous point, just as he had hoped. They hadn't seen him yet. So here he was, full of energy, barreling towards them on his skis. He started calling out. He figured they would be shocked to see anyone just emerge from the wilderness, let alone him, Amo, who they must have assumed was dead by now. He also didn't want them to mistake him for a Soviet soldier and open fire. So he shouted their names, trying to get their attention. At some point, one of the men on the mountain turned and saw him. But his reaction was not what Amo expected. The soldier looked shocked. Then he grabbed his weapon and started shooting at him. Before Amo could process what was happening, all the other soldiers, all of his comrades, were opening fire on him too. He couldn't believe it. He was yelling, "It's me! It's Imo!" But they kept shooting. He was already skiing so fast that the only thing he could do was continue his momentum. He skied right through the middle of their camp down the other side of the mountain, just trying to get away. Bullets were whizzing past his head again. Miraculously, none of them hit him. He was thinking, they think I'm a Soviet. How can they not recognize me? He had barreled right past them. After he was a good distance away from the campsite, he stopped and yelled back, "Guys, it's me!" "What are you doing?" But they were still yelling and shooting in his direction. He had no choice but to keep skiing away from them, away from the safety he thought he had found. He went on for hours, just skiing and skiing. The whole time his mind was racing. What had just happened? Even if they thought he was an enemy at first, wouldn't they have realized their mistake as he skied right through their camp? He was wearing the same uniform. He had the same weapon. Some of them must have recognized his face. It made no sense. And he was also wondering, how do I have so much energy? How am I able to do this? He had been skiing for hours and hours, had been shot at twice, had crashed into a tree. It all felt completely surreal. Amo just kept skiing until it was abundantly clear he was out of shooting range. He couldn't hear any more gunfire. He was safe again, but still deeply confused. The sun had gone down, and he knew he should stop. He needed to make a camp, regroup, and figure things out. But as he stood there in the dark, he had a strange realization. He hadn't eaten anything. He hadn't had a drop of water. He had basically been skiing at a full sprint for almost the entire day. He'd had multiple near-death experiences. But he felt great. He felt like he had more energy than he'd ever had in his life. He was baffled. Is this what a true survival situation does to you? Does your body just go into some kind of overdrive? He couldn't understand it. He stood there, literally telling himself, you need to stop. Even though you feel like you could go on forever, you need to stop. You need a fire. You need food and water. You need to rest. It felt like he was forcing himself to do these things. He had no natural urge to do them. It was like his body had forgotten the basic human needs. So, he did it. He stopped. He built a fire. He made some food. He wasn't hungry at all, but he forced himself to eat. He drank some water. Then he told himself, okay, now I'll rest. And in the morning, I'll figure out what to do next. He lay down in the snow to go to sleep. He should have been completely and utterly exhausted. But he wasn't. He couldn't sleep at all. He just lay there wide awake as the wind and snow whipped around him. He felt great, but not the least bit tired. The next morning, the sun came up, and Amo hadn't slept for a single minute. But still, he felt fine. He got up, put his skis on, gathered his things, and continued skiing in the direction he believed would eventually lead him back to Finland. As he moved, he thought about how strange his situation was. When the Soviets first attacked, his mind had been clear, but his body had failed him. His legs had gotten so tired from breaking the trail that he crashed. But now, it was the complete opposite. His mind felt delirious. He couldn't keep his thoughts straight. But his body was like a machine. It just kept going, no matter what. He skied almost without thinking, his body on some kind of autopilot. He skied for hours and hours, just pushing forward in one direction. The whole time, he didn't see another person. He was truly out in the middle of the Arctic Circle. No more Soviets, no more teammates. Just him and the endless snow. He didn't even know if he was going in the right direction, but he had to do something. He just had to keep going. That night, as he was still skiing in a straight line, not stopping, he saw something unbelievable. Up ahead, there was a person. It was the first person he had seen since the ambush at the campsite. And what was even more unbelievable was that he recognized the person. It was one of his teammates, a man named Matty. They had been together when the Soviets first attacked. Amo was flooded with relief. Matty must have gotten separated too. It was a miracle that they had found each other. Amo skied right up to Matty, waving him down. He was so happy to see a friendly face. Matty looked over at him, and thankfully, he didn't shoot. Instead, he put a finger to his lips, telling Amo to be quiet. He then beckoned him over. When Amo got next to him, he had a million questions. What do we do now? Where are we going? But Matty just told him again to be quiet, and then he gestured for them to lie down on the ground. Amo didn't understand what was going on, but he trusted Matty. He wasn't being shot at, which was a good sign. So, the two of them just lay down together in the snow. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Amo felt tired. He closed his eyes, and he drifted off to sleep almost immediately. When Amo woke up again, he was not lying in the snow with Matty. He was standing up on his skis, moving down a mountain at a steady pace, as if he were on a mission. Matty was nowhere to be found. And on top of that, Amo realized he didn't have his backpack anymore. And he didn't have his gun. He had no idea how long he'd been skiing for or where he was going. It was as if he had magically gone from being passed out in the snow to being in the middle of skiing. At this point, Amo knew something was seriously wrong with his mind. He told himself, I must be hallucinating. How else could I have been with Matty 1 second and now I'm here? It just didn't add up. As he continued to ski mindlessly along, he started to accept his fate. He thought, this is what dying feels like. You lose your mind before your body gives out. His mind was all over the place, but his body was still going at full tilt, full of that unexplainable energy. He knew that at some point that energy was going to run out, and then he would just die. That's what was going to happen. Amo's only hope was that between now and then, maybe, just maybe, someone would find him and save him. He knew it was a long shot, but it was all he had left. And so he skied on. No weapon, no backpack, no supplies. He was operating on no sleep, and he was just skiing. For days and days, he didn't stop. He couldn't believe his body was holding up. His mind was gone, but he just kept going. He didn't run into anyone. But then one day, days later, as he was skiing along, something appeared in front of him, almost like a mirage. It was a building. He couldn't tell if it was a military outpost or a civilian building. He didn't know if it was Finnish or German or Soviet. But even in his fractured mental state, he knew he had to make a choice. He could try to get to that building and hope that whoever was inside would help him. Even if they killed him, it was a better option than what he was doing now, which was just an endless ski towards his own death. So Amo started skiing faster and faster towards the building with a kind of reckless abandon. He was fully committed. This was either his rescue or his end. As he got closer, he saw that it was a military installation. And unbelievably, it was a German military installation. At this point in the war, the Finns were allied with the Germans. This was a safe place. He was so relieved he could have cried. He couldn't believe he might actually survive this. He kicked off his skis and started running towards the front door of the building. But before he could get there, he stepped on something. There was a loud bang. He was thrown into the air and came crashing back down onto the snow. When Amo opened his eyes, he took stock of what had just happened. He still didn't feel any pain, but when he looked down, he saw that his foot was a bloody mess. There were literally bones poking out of his ankle. He had clearly stepped on a landmine. But Amo was determined to get into that building. He pulled himself up, channeling that unbelievable endurance he'd been feeling for days. He stood up on his one good foot and started hobbling his way towards the door. He finally made it to the front of the German military base. He reached out, grabbed the doorknob, and was just about to open it when there was another loud bang. He was thrown into the air again. He had stepped on a second landmine. He came smashing down, but he still didn't die. He still felt no pain. But when he looked down at his legs, he saw that his other leg, the one that had been uninjured just a minute ago, was now also mangled. Now he couldn't even stand. He was completely incapacitated. And to make matters worse, as he looked more closely at the building, he realized it was abandoned. There was no one here. This wasn't going to save him. He was trapped. At this point, Amo just gave up. He said to himself, "You know what? It's over. I'm going to die." He crawled over to a nearby ditch and let himself roll into it. And he just waited to die. He knew it was over. But for days, he didn't die. He just lay there in the ditch, wanting it to be over. What else could he do? Who was going to save him now? He just watched the sun come up and go down over and over again. He lost track of how many days he was lying there, bleeding profusely from his grievous injuries. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't had water. He couldn't believe he was still alive. Then one day, as he was lying in the ditch, he looked up and saw what looked like a plane flying overhead. He was in such bad shape that he didn't know if he was hallucinating again. But he felt like this one was real. After watching the plane circle for a minute, Amo was almost certain he heard the sound of it landing nearby. A few minutes later, from his position in the ditch, he could have sworn he heard people speaking in Finnish, his native language. He still didn't know if it was real, but then a head poked over the top of the ditch. It was a young Finnish man, looking down at him. Amo looked back up at him. And a second later, he was being pulled out of the ditch. Later that day, Amo found himself lying in a hospital bed in Finland. The man, the plane, the rescue, it was all real. He had been saved. At the hospital, the doctors and nurses were shocked by his condition. He weighed just 94 pounds. He was badly burned and frostbitten. Both of his legs were horribly mangled. And his heart was beating at a staggering 200 beats per minute, even though he was just lying in bed. Even crazier, they couldn't get his heart to slow down. It just kept racing at that impossibly high level. The staff couldn't understand how he was even alive. A heart can't beat that fast for that long without giving out. But after they spoke to Amo and he recounted the whole unbelievable ordeal, they learned one specific detail that explained everything. Back when Amo and his comrades were first ambushed, he was struggling to keep up. He was exhausted and falling behind, and he was terrified of being captured or killed by the Soviets. So, in a moment of desperation, before he crashed, he tried something. He pulled out a special military ration he had been issued. It was a stimulant designed to give soldiers a burst of energy in extreme situations. He took it, thinking it would give him the boost he needed to escape with his teammates. But the ration didn't seem to work immediately. He was still so tired that he crashed and passed out. However, when Amo woke up, the drug had kicked in. That's why he felt so hyper-alert, why he had so much energy. It's what allowed him to ski for days without food, water, or sleep. It's why he didn't feel any pain when he was blown up by 2 landmines. It's why his body refused to die, even as he lay bleeding in a ditch for a week. These rations had done their job. They had given him more than enough energy to survive for 2 crazy weeks in the wild. The military ration was a drug called Pervitin. And the thing about Pervitin is that it's just pure methamphetamine. In essence, Amo Koivunen survived in the wild for 2 weeks because he was on a meth-fueled rampage. He was completely high the entire time, and it saved his life. But Pervitin has 2 very distinct downsides. 1. It's incredibly addictive. And 2. It causes extremely intense and vivid hallucinations. So, it's very likely that Amo never actually came across his own battalion, and they never opened fire on him. He probably never met his teammate Maddie out in the wilderness. We're not even sure if the German military installation he saw was real. It's very likely that all of it was just a product of his mind, a powerful hallucination brought on by the drug. The landmines, however, those were very real. Somewhat unbelievably, Amo would go on to make a full recovery. He got married, he had 9 children, and he lived to the age of 71. And as grateful as he was to the drug that saved his life, he never took Pervitin again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick was sitting on the floor of a vacant studio apartment. He was in a somewhat run-down apartment building where he both lived and worked, located in a coastal town in northern England called Satan, Carew. The building itself was called The Cliff, and it was perched right across the street from the ocean, offering a wide, gray view of the water. Carl was in the middle of a job, painting the apartment to get it ready for a new tenant, but he'd taken a break. He had his lunch spread out on a dust sheet beside him and was deep into one of his favorite spy novels. Carl was a huge fan of spy stories. He had a small collection of books that he would just read over and over again, finding something new in them each time. But as he was about to turn a page, a movement outside the window pulled his attention away from the book. He looked out and saw his landlady, a woman named Anne Darwin. She lived in a large Victorian house right next door to the apartment building. At that moment, she was standing in front of her house, but she wasn't alone. She was with her 2 adult sons, Anthony and Mark. What struck Carl immediately was that all 3 of them were dressed entirely in black. And each one was holding a wreath made of flowers. Feeling a bit like one of the spies from his novels, Carl stayed low and watched from the window. He saw the family of 3 walk across the street together, moving towards a grassy knoll that overlooked the sea. From his vantage point, he watched as Anne and her sons stood there for a moment, then bowed their heads. He could tell they were likely praying or sharing a moment of quiet remembrance. Then, one by one, all 3 of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean, watching as the waves carried them away. Carl knew exactly what this was about. They were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin. 2 years earlier, John had died in a tragic kayaking accident right there in the waters just in front of their house. As Carl watched, he could see Anne's shoulders shaking. It was clear she was crying, and seeing her grief made him feel a pang of sadness himself. Carl cared deeply for Anne. Their relationship was complicated. He wasn't just her handyman and tenant, they had been secretly and romantically involved for almost 2 years, ever since he had first moved into the cliff. But Carl's connection to Anne went back much further than that. He had known her for most of his life, and, if he was being honest with himself, he had been in love with her for decades. Both Carl and Anne had grown up in a town near Satan, Carew. The very first time Carl ever saw her was on the school bus back in high school. He had been completely captivated by her, but was too shy to ever work up the courage to say hello. Soon after, he left for college, but the memory of her never really faded. After finishing his education, Carl went on to build a life of his own. He became a school teacher and started a family. But his life took a sharp downturn after he made a series of really bad real estate investments. His financial troubles spiraled into legal troubles, and eventually, it all fell apart. He ended up leaving his family and going on the run from the police. He found himself living in the woods just outside of Satan, Carew, a shadow of the man he once was. And that's when fate, or something like it, brought him and Anne back into each other's lives. One evening, he was near his campsite when he saw a car pull into a nearby parking lot. He recognized Anne at the wheel, and she looked incredibly upset. This time, all these years later, he decided to approach her. He walked over to her car and gently knocked on the window. It turned out that her husband's kayaking accident had happened only a few weeks before. She was emotionally shattered and completely overwhelmed. On top of her grief, she was also desperate for help managing the properties she and her husband had owned together. That very same night, she offered him a place to stay. She let him move into one of the empty apartments at the cliff. And once Carl was settled in, their relationship slowly blossomed into a quiet, unconventional romance. His days were spent working, fixing up the apartments in the building. His nights were spent with Anne in her house next door. Keeping their relationship a secret was strange for both of them, but they each had their reasons. Carl was terrified of being arrested. He was still a wanted man, so if anyone knew his true identity or where he was, it would all be over. For Anne, the situation was different. She felt that her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow, possibly for the rest of her life. She was worried about what people would think if it looked like she had moved on so quickly after her husband's death. Their shared dream was that at some point, Anne could sell her properties. They would take the money, move far away together, and start a completely new life. But they both knew it was a long shot. The biggest hurdle was Carl. He would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without a valid passport and without getting arrested. Back in the apartment, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street and into their house. He sighed, picked up his spy novel, and went back to reading. But he wasn't just reading for pleasure anymore. As he followed the story's plot and the actions of the main character, he was making mental notes. He was actively searching for inspiration, for a clever trick or a loophole he could use. Carl was working on a grand plan, a plan that he hoped would finally allow him and Anne to escape and start their new life together. He was using these spy novels as his textbooks. A small smile crept onto his face as he thought about how brilliant his scheme was. He even imagined that someday in the future, an author might write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 long years for Carl to finalize every detail of his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready. He walked through the airport near Satan Karu, trying his best to look casual and blend in with the other travelers. He approached the ticketing counter, his heart pounding in his chest. He handed his passport to the gate agent, then glanced over his shoulder. He saw Anne standing at the back of the line. Their eyes met for just a second before she quickly looked away. They had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other, just in case something went wrong. When Carl turned back, he saw the ticketing agent staring intently at his passport. His heart rate kicked up another notch. This was the moment of truth. The passport he was using was a fake. He had meticulously created a whole new identity for himself. He had used the birth and death records of a baby who had been born in the same year as him but had died in infancy. It was an idea he'd lifted directly from one of his favorite spy novels, The Day of the Jackal, which was about an assassin who constantly changed identities. If this worked, if this agent bought the fake passport, he and Anne would be on a flight to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was to stay there permanently. He hoped that Anne would fall in love with the place and eventually move there to be with him. He had read a travel brochure on Panama that described it as a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases. That description made him feel like he would fit right in. Plus, the cost of living was incredibly low compared to the UK, and it was thousands of miles away from anyone who might recognize him. It seemed like the perfect place for them to disappear. But everything hinged on this one moment. It all depended on his fake passport being convincing enough to get past this agent. After what felt like an eternity, the agent looked up from the passport, smiled, and handed it back to Carl along with his boarding pass. Carl had to physically restrain himself from letting out a huge sigh of relief. Instead, he just gave a casual thank you to the agent. As he walked away from the counter, he turned back one more time and gave a subtle wink to Anne, who was still waiting in line. After decades of just reading about international spies, Carl felt like he had finally become one. And, he had to admit, he liked the feeling a lot. Soon, he would be living full-time as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep. A real estate agent was driving them through the lush Panamanian countryside. They sped along a highway that cut through the jungle, and with every mile, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a sharp bend in the road, and suddenly, the dense jungle gave way to a stunning, sandy beach. The realtor pulled the car over and told them to get out, to take a look around and see if this particular plot of land felt like it could be their new home. Carl had done the math 100 times. Once Anne sold the apartment building and combined that money with the life insurance payout she had received after her husband's death, they would have around £600,000 in savings. That was roughly 800,000 American dollars. It was more than enough to get them set up, but they would need a steady source of income in Panama as well. That's where this land came in. Carl's big idea was to buy this piece of jungle paradise and open an eco-lodge resort. These types of resorts were becoming incredibly popular in Central America. Tourists would pay good money to stay in rustic beachside cabins for a week, go canoeing, horseback riding, and trekking through the jungle. Carl also planned to build a private villa on the property just for him and Anne, right there on the beach. He led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed across the bay to the tree line. He told her to imagine a row of beautiful cabins nestled among the trees. He described a long dock stretching out into the water with a bunch of canoes tied up to it. He talked about a path that would lead from the cabins to a horse stable hidden in the woods. Then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to picture a magnificent seaside villa, their home, where the two of them would live out their days. Anne kicked off her sandals and waded into the warm water. Carl could see it in her eyes. She was picturing it, imagining the life they could have here. For Carl, it felt like years of meticulous, risky planning were finally about to pay off. This trip had been the best week of his entire relationship with Anne. For the first time, they could act like a normal couple. They went out to dinner in public every night. They walked down the street holding hands without fear. Carl loved being John Jones. He felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in a very long time. And oddly enough, even though his identity was a complete fabrication, he felt more like his old self, the person he was before all the debt and the legal problems had crushed him. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne was completely sold on the idea. She told Carl that she was taken with Panama and that yes, she wanted to move here with him. She promised that as soon as she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and prepare for the big move. Carl was beaming. Their realtor, sensing the happy moment, grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the day they decided to change their lives forever. It took another full year for Anne to sort everything out back home. She had to sell her properties in Satan, Carew, and even more difficult, she had to tell her family that she was moving to Panama of all places. They were all shocked at first. It seemed like such a random and drastic decision, but eventually they came to understand. They believed she needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life with John. Shortly after Anne sold the last of the properties, Carl used some of their funds to buy a condominium in Panama City. It would be a place for them to live while they were building their dream resort. And then, finally, on the 22nd of October 2007, Anne moved to Panama for good. That night, Carl picked her up from the airport and drove her to their new home. As he drove, he had to force a smile. He had recently discovered some news, some terrible news, that was going to throw their entire new life into jeopardy. He gave Anne a quick tour of their penthouse apartment, then asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. Anne immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her expression shifted from excitement to worry. Carl took a deep breath. He told Anne how excited he was to build their resort together, but then he dropped the bomb. There was one last, unexpected obstacle standing in their way. He explained that he had only learned about it a few weeks ago and had been waiting for the right moment to tell her in person. He had discovered that the Panamanian government had recently instituted new procedures for anyone moving to the country. All new residents, including English citizens, now needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police. This was to prove they had no criminal record. For Anne, this was no problem at all. But for Carl, it was a catastrophe. He was living in Panama as John Jones. If the authorities looked into his identity, they would very quickly discover that John Jones didn't really exist. Anne put her head in her hands and whispered, "What are we going to do?" Carl admitted that he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised her that he would figure something out. He always did. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne along a busy street in Panama City. They window shopped, but Carl's mind was racing. He was trying to think of any possible way he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in Panama illegally. He was done with hiding. The whole point of coming here was so that he and Anne could finally live their lives together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop where she was looking at furniture for their new apartment. As he wandered aimlessly around the store, he came across a bookshelf filled with old books. He saw a few spy novels among them. All the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't read them, but he picked one up anyway. He began flipping through the pages, just hoping for some kind of spark, some kind of inspiration. And as he stood there, an idea did come to him. But it wasn't inspired by the book in his hands. He suddenly remembered the plot of a different spy novel, one he had read more than a decade ago. At the time he read it, he had thought the central plot was absolutely insane, far too crazy to ever work in real life. But now, as he and Anne walked around the city that afternoon, he kept coming back to that idea. He started to turn it over in his mind, seeing how he might just be able to adapt it to his own situation. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was incredibly risky, maybe the riskiest thing they had ever attempted. But he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of December 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom. He was wandering around the West End of London, doing his best to look utterly lost and confused. He walked through streets decorated with festive Christmas displays, looking around with a vacant expression until a concerned store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. Carl gave her a shy, hesitant smile and asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" When she told him it was because it was December, he pretended to be baffled, as if he had no idea what month or even what year it was. He claimed he didn't know where he was. He then asked the clerk for help. Just as he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern. She took him by the arm and escorted him to the nearest police station. Inside, she explained to the officer at the front desk that something was seriously wrong with this man. The officer smiled kindly at Carl and asked him what the problem was. Carl knew that what he did next had to be an award-winning acting performance. The success of his entire plan depended on it. He scratched at his head, looked at the officer with pleading eyes, and said that he thought he had lost his whole family. The officer's demeanor immediately became more serious. He sat up straighter and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Carl had come to a realization. The only way he could ever truly feel like his old self again in Panama was to actually become his old self. He needed to reclaim the identity he had left behind. But to do that without also reclaiming all his old debt and his outstanding legal problems, it was going to require one more colossal lie. Carl looked the police officer in the eye and explained that he knew his name, but that was it. He claimed he couldn't remember anything else about himself because, he said, he had amnesia. The officer just stared at him, obviously dumbfounded. He then turned and called for his supervisor. From that moment on, things started to move very, very fast, but not at all in the direction that Carl had expected. Carl had believed that by claiming amnesia, he could essentially wipe his slate clean in England. He figured he could resume his old life under his real name, make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial position, and then get a real, legitimate passport. With that, he and Anne could live happily and truly openly in Panama. But that is not what happened. Almost immediately, the newspapers caught wind of his incredible story, and it exploded. It made the front page. To the rest of the world, Carl had a story that was almost unbelievable. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, a man with no memory of his past, no knowledge of his own identity. Almost overnight, he became a massive international news sensation. The entire world wanted to know, where had this man been for the past few years? Carl had not anticipated any of this publicity. He and Anne were both horrified. Their horror turned to pure panic when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph they had found on an obscure real estate website in Panama. In the picture, Carl could be seen standing next to Anne and their realtor. All three of them were beaming with happiness after a successful day of viewing properties. This photograph was very, very bad for Carl. It was irrefutable proof that he had not been wandering around the UK homeless with amnesia, just as he had told the police. But the photo was even worse for Anne. It was devastating, because it proved something far more shocking, far more terrible than simple financial fraud. This one picture unraveled a story so outlandish that it sounded like it must have come directly from the pages of a fictional spy novel. It would turn out that Anne was not the grieving widow she had pretended to be for years. And her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick at all. Carl's real name, the one he had given to that police officer in London when he was faking amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's supposedly dead husband. The two of them had faked his death in that kayaking accident all those years ago. It was an elaborate scheme to escape his crippling debt and so that they could fraudulently claim his life insurance money. Not even their own sons knew their father was still alive. For years, they had grieved for a man who was secretly living right next door. Only Anne and, of course, John were in on the secret. John and Anne were both quickly arrested for fraud. They ended up serving more than 3 years in prison. In a strange way, John's very unhappy ending mirrors the ending of the very book he used for inspiration, The Day of the Jackal. In that novel, the assassin pulls off a series of impressive feats to change his identity and evade capture, but in the end, he still gets caught. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on the 9th of October 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Bologasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station. This station was located on a remote, frozen island in Antarctica. The common room served as the general multipurpose hangout area for the station's crew. Oleg was sitting there watching television while his coworker, a man named Sergei, sat in a chair nearby, quietly reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol and had been for a while. When they weren't on duty, there really wasn't much else to do in that isolated place besides sit around and drink. Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months at this point. He was part of a 14-person crew on a year-round research mission. Their job was to observe the island's ocean and weather patterns, collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg's primary responsibility was maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which kept him busy for a good portion of the day. But there was still a significant amount of downtime, and Oleg spent almost all of it inside. Being outside in Antarctica was generally a very bad idea. The landscape was riddled with hundreds of lethal, deep ice crevasses, many of them barely visible under the snow. If you fell into one, you were dead. The fall itself could kill you, or you would simply be trapped and freeze. On top of that, there were the obviously freezing temperatures and the constant threat of violent, lethal blizzards. It was a place that was fundamentally not built for human beings. So, Oleg and his coworkers only ever went outside when their work absolutely required it. Otherwise, they were confined to the station's buildings. And inside, their entertainment options were severely limited. There was a television that only got 2 channels. There was a small gym. There was a nearby church. And there was a library. By this point in his tour, Oleg was sick of all of it. He was even tired of the library, which was a shame because he loved to read. But the library was tiny, and he had already read almost every single book on its shelves. His colleague, Sergei, who was sitting near him, also loved to read. Books were one of the few things the two men actually spent a lot of time talking about. Since Oleg couldn't find anything interesting to watch on the two-channel TV and was feeling intensely bored and stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergei was in the mood for one of their deep, literary conversations. Oleg turned off the TV, tossed the remote onto a chair, and took a long swig of his drink. He glanced over to the corner where Sergei was absorbed in his book. He saw the cover. It was the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read it. The book is about a depressed man suffering from insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts a secret club where people just literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had one of the most epic plot twists he had ever read. So, Oleg got up and walked over to Sergei. He asked him what he thought of the book so far. But Sergei just grunted and kept reading, effectively ignoring him. Oleg wasn't surprised by this. He knew Sergei very well. The two of them had worked closely together on various research projects over the years. He knew that Sergei was a generally quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved to get into long, passionate discussions about everything and anything. Sometimes, Oleg could coax Sergei out of his shell by asking a lot of questions or telling jokes. But today did not seem to be one of those days. This was frustrating for Oleg, but he could take a hint. He could tell that Sergei just wanted to be left alone to read. So, he stood up and left the common room to go find something else to do. Oleg spent the next few hours just wandering around the station, checking some of the research logs, and continuing to sip his drink. He briefly thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air. But when he checked the outdoor temperature, he saw that it was well below freezing. He decided against it. So, after 3 hours of trying and failing to kill time, Oleg finally gave up and headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 in the afternoon when Oleg stepped into the dining room. He was feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he had been drinking all day. And the first person he saw when he got inside was Sergei. He was sitting at a table, still reading Fight Club, just as he had been doing hours earlier in the common room. Oleg got himself some food and then went over to sit with Sergei. He figured he'd try again and see if maybe now he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, he was. When Oleg sat down, Sergei actually put his book down on the table and looked up, ready to talk. It was possible that he had also had a lot to drink by this point and was feeling a bit more sociable. So the two men began to discuss the book Fight Club. Very quickly, their conversation became really energetic. They were both a bit drunk and were getting excited about the points they were making. Then, Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic and insightful point about the book and its deeper meaning. To Oleg, it seemed like the conversation was going great. But then, all of a sudden, right after he made his point, Oleg noticed that Sergei had gone completely silent. His face had changed. Oleg, who could read Sergei very well by now, knew what this meant. Sergei was done talking. He wanted some space again. Oleg glanced down at his watch. He realized he actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over. He was about to look up and tell Sergei that he was going to go leave to check on one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergei was gone. He had vanished from the table. And at that exact same moment, a wild, agonized scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building at the station, the research station's manager was in his office, going through some paperwork. Suddenly, his office door flew open with a bang. The manager looked up and saw one of his employees standing in the doorway, looking absolutely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps, like he was in a state of shock. When the employee managed to explain why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the man not to move. He then grabbed his heavy coat and flew out the door, into the brutal, freezing cold. The manager struggled to pull on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground, heading for the building that housed the cafeteria. The whole way there, he felt his own panic growing and growing. Because what that employee had just told him was something that had never, ever happened at their research station before. In fact, he wasn't even sure if it had ever happened on the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally reached the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside. What he saw made him feel immediately sick to his stomach. It would turn out that Oleg and Sergei had been coworkers for a very long time. And because they knew each other so well, Oleg had learned over the years what specific things really truly annoyed Sergei. And Oleg, it seems, used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergei was by violating a very serious, unspoken rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Every single time Sergei would start reading a new book, Oleg would wait until he was about halfway through, and then he would spoil the ending for him. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a pattern. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly and deliberately ruined them for Sergei, which always made Sergei incredibly angry. And that day, in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergei, he didn't just make a great point about the book Fight Club. He told Sergei exactly how it ended. He revealed the big, famous twist. And Sergei, who was very drunk and who, like Oleg, had also been feeling very restless and tense from having been cooped up in that isolated station for months on end, finally snapped. This time, when Oleg spoiled the ending, Sergei completely lost control. He went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, walked up behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest, all while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Once Sergei had calmed down, he was so shocked and horrified by what he had done that he immediately walked to the manager's office and turned himself in. He was then transported all the way back to Russia and arrested. He was eventually acquitted, however, since he had no previous criminal record. As for Oleg, his heart was severely damaged in the attack, but amazingly, after being evacuated to a hospital, he would survive. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On a very early morning in December of 1991, a woman living in the quiet community of Largo, Florida, was pulled from her sleep by a sound she couldn't quite place. It was a loud, rhythmic pounding. As she sat up in her bed, her mind still clearing the fog of sleep, she realized the sound was coming from her front door. But it wasn't just pounding. Layered over it was a desperate sound, a woman screaming for help. Realizing this was a genuine crisis, the woman didn't hesitate. She threw off her blankets and rushed to the front of her house. She unlatched the locks and pulled the door open, and what she saw on her front porch made her stop cold. It was her neighbor. And this neighbor was almost completely covered in blood. It was matted in her hair, streaked down her face, and soaked into her nightgown. There were deep gashes on her head, and a long, terrible wound across her throat was still bleeding freely. Before the neighbor could even manage to say what had happened or what was wrong, her eyes rolled back in her head and she just collapsed right there on the porch, unconscious. On the evening of the 14th of December, 1991, just hours before this chaos erupted, 3-1 year, old Keith Young was grabbing his car keys from a small hook by the front door of his home, also in Largo, Florida. Behind him, his wife Anita was slipping on her favorite pair of heels, getting ready for a night out. The newlyweds were about to head out for a much-needed date night. Life for them was hectic, to say the least. This was the second marriage for both of them, and between the two of them, they had a blended family of 6 children from their previous relationships. Finding time for just themselves was a rare and precious thing. But on this particular night, the stars had aligned. Keith's 2 kids were spending the weekend with their mother, who shared custody. Anita's 8-year-old daughter was at a sleepover with a friend. And her 2-year-old son, a mature and responsible kid named Jason, had agreed to stay home and watch his 2 younger siblings so the adults could finally have a quiet dinner together. Before they walked out the door, Keith gave Jason a final rundown of the rules and expectations. Don't make a huge mess. Make sure nobody gets hurt. And just in case there was some kind of emergency, he had written down the phone number of the restaurant on a notepad in the kitchen. But Keith also made sure to remind Jason that if there was a real emergency, a true crisis, he shouldn't hesitate. He should call 911 right away. Jason, with the classic confidence of a 1-2-year-old, just kind of rolled his eyes and gave his stepdad a look that said, Yeah, I've got this. It's under control. Now, Keith knew he was probably being a little uptight, a little overprotective, but there was a reason for his anxiety. Earlier that same year, there had been an attempted break-in at their house, and the incident had left him on edge ever since, especially about leaving the kids home alone. The intruder in that incident had done something very specific and unsettling. They had cut the home's phone lines before trying to get in. They had also removed a window screen and even tried to force a door open. But for some reason, they had left without taking anything. The police had investigated, but critically, the suspect was never caught. So for the family, it was this unresolved, lingering threat that made them feel unsafe in their own home. Keith and Anita both gave Jason a big hug goodbye as they walked out into the cool Florida night. And once the front door clicked shut behind them, Keith, just to be extra sure, turned back and jiggled the handle, double-checking that it was locked. Less than half an hour later, Keith and Anita were sitting across from each other at a table in a quiet restaurant. They unfolded their napkins onto their laps, the simple act feeling like a luxury. They were so excited to have a few hours of peace, a chance to focus on each other, something that their busy lives rarely allowed. The couple had gotten married earlier that year. They had met at a support group for single parents, a place where they both found someone who understood the challenges they were facing. They were incredibly grateful to have found each other, especially because their previous marriages had been so difficult. Anita's ex-husband, a man named Luther Bass, had a notoriously violent temper. And even though he now lived all the way across the country in Idaho, he still seemed to find ways to complicate Anita's life. Just that past summer, Luther had driven all the way from Idaho to Florida to pick up his kids for a vacation, something Anita had initially agreed to. But when he arrived, he wasn't alone. He showed up in a camper with his new girlfriend and her children. The whole situation gave Anita a terrible feeling. She became deeply worried that if she let her kids go with him, Luther might just refuse to bring them back. This led to a huge argument right there in the driveway. It got so heated that Anita eventually had to threaten to call the police before Luther finally backed down and left in a rage. Meanwhile, Keith was having his own set of problems with his ex-spouse, Linda. They were in the middle of equally heated arguments about where their kids would spend the upcoming holidays. Would they be with him and Anita, or with Linda and her new husband, Steve? Things had gotten so nasty between them that Linda had recently started harassing Anita, making angry phone calls to the house. She was also gearing up for a legal battle, threatening to go back to court and try to get the custody agreement changed if Keith didn't agree to do things her way. But all of these conflicts with their exes only made Keith more grateful that he had found Anita. He was happy that he could finally provide for her and her children, to take care of them in a way he felt they truly deserved. So, despite all the tension hanging over their lives, he did his best to keep the mood light during dinner. They enjoyed their meal, talking and laughing, and for a couple of hours, they were able to forget about everything else. When the check finally came, Keith glanced down at his watch and was surprised to see how late it had gotten. He knew Jason was a responsible kid and could definitely handle getting his younger siblings into bed on his own, but that old worry about leaving the kids alone for too long was creeping back in. So, he paid the check right away, and he and Anita left the restaurant and started the drive home. A little while later, they pulled up outside of their brown single-story house. As they walked inside, Keith felt a wave of relief wash over him. The house was quiet. All the kids were calmly watching TV in the living room, and the family cat was curled up asleep on the couch right next to them. Keith announced that it was time for everyone to get ready for bed. As 2-year-old, Jason got up from the couch, Keith pulled him in for a big hug and told him how proud he was of him for doing such a good job babysitting. Anita helped the younger kids brush their teeth. And afterwards, Keith went through the house, turning off the lights. He went down the hall and said goodnight to all 3 kids, who were climbing into their bunk beds in the room they shared. After that, he continued down the hallway to the main bedroom, where Anita was already waiting. He climbed into bed, kissed his wife goodnight, and then turned off the light. Several hours later, around 3:00 in the morning, Anita's 2-year-old son Jason was jolted awake by a very loud noise. He sat bolt upright in his bed. He listened, trying to figure out what he had just heard. Then he could hear something else, a thumping sound coming from the room next to his. But before he could even begin to process what was happening, someone screamed. It was a terrifying, panicked sound. With his vision still blurry from sleep, Jason carefully slid off the top bunk. He crept over to his bedroom door and cracked it open just enough to see into the hallway. In the dim, shadowy light, he could make out the shapes of what looked like two men. They were moving around, struggling with each other, fighting. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, he realized with a jolt of terror that one of those men was his stepdad, Keith. He couldn't make out any details about the other man, except that he was very big and was wearing a black ski mask over his head. Jason was immediately paralyzed by fear. He knew instantly that this was another intruder, just like the one who had tried to break into their house that summer. For a split second, he held on to a desperate hope that maybe his stepdad would be able to fight the man off. But then, in a flash of movement, he saw something that made his stomach drop. There was blood sprayed all over the walls of the hallway. And then he saw the glint of a knife in the intruder's hand. At that exact same moment, Jason saw his mother, Anita, run out of the master bedroom. She was also covered in blood. She was holding a baseball bat, and she swung it with all her might at the intruder, hitting him hard in the back of the head. But the blow barely seemed to slow him down. And that's when Jason heard his stepdad's voice, strained and desperate, yelling for Anita to get the gun. Anita turned and ran into another room. Jason just stood there, frozen behind the door, watching through the crack in a state of shock as this huge intruder literally picked Keith up off his feet and threw him back into the master bedroom. The next thing Jason knew, his mother was back in the hallway. She was standing there holding a gun. And the intruder, seeing this, turned and ran, sprinting away and out the front door. Suddenly, Jason snapped out of the shocked trance he had been in. He remembered what Keith had told him to do in case of a real emergency. Call 911. He ran to the phone in the kitchen, snatched it up, and dialed the numbers. But when he put the receiver to his ear, all he heard was dead silence. There was no dial tone. The line was completely dead. Jason looked over and saw his mother hobbling towards him. She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, and he could see blood visibly dripping down her neck. Jason's voice cracked as he told his mother that the phone wasn't working. Anita, barely able to stand, told her son to go back and wait with his stepdad. She said she was going to go find help. So Jason started walking back towards the bedroom where he knew his stepdad was. As he did, he watched his mom stumble out the front door and disappear into the night. Jason went down the hallway and into the master bedroom. He saw his stepdad sprawled out on the bed. He was still alive, but he was clearly struggling to breathe, making a terrible, raspy sound. Jason, a 2-year-old kid, faced with an impossible situation, had no idea what to do. So he just walked over to the bed, knelt down beside it, and took Keith's hand. He just held it while he waited for his mom to come back with help. And as he held Keith's hand, he listened to the sound of his stepfather taking his last few labored breaths before he went completely limp. Several hours later, just before dawn on the morning of the 15th of December, 1991, Detective Mike Short from the Largo Police Department pulled his car up to the curb outside of a brown, single-story house. The entire property was surrounded by yellow crime scene tape. He'd gotten a call from his supervisor, who didn't have a lot of details, just that an intruder had broken into this house and attacked a husband and wife while they slept. But now, as Short got out of his car and looked around at the quiet block of modest, well-kept homes, he found the whole situation a bit odd. This just wasn't the kind of neighborhood where they saw violent home invasions. It was a peaceful, family-oriented area. As Detective Short walked up towards the house, a uniformed officer met him and gave him a few more details about what they knew so far. He said that the wife, Anita Young, had managed to run to a neighbor's house screaming for help before she passed out from blood loss in their front yard. The husband, Keith Young, was deceased inside in the bedroom. The officer also said that the couple's 1-2-year-old son had woken up at some point during the night and had witnessed part of the attack. For now, the boy was safe over at the neighbor's house until they could track down another guardian. The officer told Short that Anita had been rushed to a hospital, but it would be a miracle if she survived. Her injuries were some of the worst the first responders had ever seen. As Short went up the walkway that led to the front door, he saw that blood had dripped all over the cement path. The front door was wide open, and just inside he saw a baseball bat lying on the floor. There was blood on the handle. Short stepped over it and into the house, and he was met with the sight of more blood. It was spattered and smeared basically everywhere in the living room, on the walls, the doors, the furniture. It looked as if the suspect and the victims had been engaged in a desperate, moving fight all throughout the house. In fact, the scene was so chaotic and messy that Short's first thought was that maybe the suspect wasn't expecting to have to fight off two grown adults. Otherwise, they might have come up with a more efficient plan of attack. So, Short's initial assumption was that this was likely a robbery that had gone terribly, horribly wrong. As he continued down the hallway, a cat suddenly ran past him. It seemed to be unharmed, and it quickly went to hide under the couch. The hallway, almost unbelievably, was even bloodier than the living room. There were red smears all over the walls and the floors. So Short figured that the main part of the struggle must have happened right here. Short reached the main bedroom and looked inside. He saw Keith's body lying on the bed, covered from head to toe in blood. Keith's shirt was shredded, and Short could see that he had multiple stab wounds to his chest and also a very deep gash running down his side. Short decided not to actually enter the bedroom until the crime scene technicians had gone through it for forensic evidence. So instead, he just walked down the rest of the hallway and pushed open the door to another bedroom. He was surprised to see two small children, a boy and a girl, soundly asleep in their bunk beds. Somehow, these little kids had slept right through the entire violent attack. Short immediately went back outside and flagged down a uniformed officer. He told him to go in there, gently wake up those kids, and bring them somewhere safe. Once the officer went inside, Short pulled out his flashlight and began searching the yard for any more evidence. Based on the wounds he had seen on Keith, Short thought he was probably attacked with a knife or maybe even something larger, like an axe or a machete. But apart from that bloody baseball bat that was found in the doorway, there was no sign of a weapon anywhere inside or outside of the house. But as Short made his way around to the side of the house, he found something else that was very interesting. The home's phone lines had been very clearly and deliberately cut. This changed everything. The killer must have planned ahead. They had made sure that nobody in this house would be able to call out for help. And this was so interesting because nothing else about the chaotic scene suggested that this crime was carefully planned. In fact, in many ways, it looked like it was very unplanned. But now, Short had to consider that maybe this was not just a random robbery gone wrong. Maybe, especially given the cut phone lines, this was a premeditated attack, a premeditated murder. And if that was the case, he had to figure out who the intended target was. Was it Keith, or Anita, or both of them? A little while later, Detective Short walked up the street to the neighbor's house to speak with his best and only eyewitness, Anita's 1-2-year-old son, Jason. After Short knocked, the neighbors led him inside and showed him into their living room. He saw Jason sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, still wearing his pajamas. Short sat down across from him and told him that he knew it must be extremely difficult to talk about this, but he really needed to know exactly what he had seen and what he had heard during the attack. Tears began to roll down Jason's face as he began to describe the terrifying scene of watching his mother and stepfather fight off the intruder. Jason said he couldn't really describe what the person looked like because they were wearing a ski mask, but he was pretty sure it was a man. He also said that there had been a little bit of skin exposed on the killer's neck, and from the looks of it, it appeared like their skin was maybe fairly dark. So Short wrote down in his notes that the suspect likely had dark skin. But because it was so dark in the hallway, and Jason clearly had not gotten a very good look at the killer, he knew the boy could be mistaken. So he just put it down as a possibility. Short then asked Jason if the intruder had said anything during the attack. Jason just shook his head and said no. He said the intruder didn't say a single word the entire time. Short made a note of that too, because it made him wonder if maybe the killer was someone close to the family. Someone who knew that if they spoke, their voice might be recognized, even by a 1-2-year-old boy. Later that same morning, once the sun had fully come up, Short went back to Keith and Anita's house. He searched the outside of the property again, just in case he had missed anything in the dark. And while he was searching the front yard, another police cruiser pulled up to the curb. A female officer got out and walked over to Short. She asked if he was the lead investigator on the case. When he confirmed that he was, the officer told him that she had been waiting at the hospital all morning, and Anita had finally woken up enough to say a few words. She said Anita was only awake for a few minutes before she had to be rushed back into another surgery, but it was just long enough for her to answer a couple of questions. Anita had described waking up to see a man standing over her bed with an axe in one hand and a knife in the other. She said it was a man she had never seen before in her life. She didn't recognize anything about him. The officer said that right before Anita was taken off to surgery, there was one more thing she had mentioned. There had been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and the intruder during that break-in had also cut their phone lines. Short instinctively turned and looked at the side of the house where those lines had been severed. He thought to himself, this is just too strange of a coincidence to be ignored. Later that day, back at the station, Short read through the reports on the interviews his team had conducted with Keith and Anita's other children and their neighbors. A team of 5 detectives had been assigned to the case, and they had made quick progress on collecting background information on the victims. Everybody in the neighborhood had described Keith and Anita as a very normal, happy couple. Keith was an air conditioning technician who had been working at the same company for a very long time, and Anita was mostly a stay-at-home mom who did some accounting work on the side. However, what also came out in these interviews was that both Keith and Anita had ex-spouses who could potentially have a motive to hurt them. Anita's ex-husband, Luther, lived thousands of miles away in Boise, Idaho. But Short knew that despite the long distance, it was not impossible that he might have traveled to Florida to commit this crime. So Short picked up the phone and called the Boise Police Department. He told them about the attack and asked them to track down Luther and question him immediately. As for Keith's ex-wife Linda, Short had learned that she actually lived right there in Largo. And Keith's 2 kids from their marriage were still at her house, completely unaware that their father was dead. And since Linda and her new husband Steve were now potential suspects, Short wanted to be the one to break the news to them. He wanted to see how they would all react. So he looked up Linda's address in the police database, then grabbed his keys and headed out the door. Less than an hour later, Short parked his car in Linda's driveway and walked up to her front door. He knocked, and a woman opened it. Short asked her if she was Linda, and she said yes. He then flashed his badge and said he'd like to come inside and speak with her. Linda seemed a bit confused by the visit from a detective, but she opened the door wider and let him in. Short walked into what seemed like a perfectly normal Sunday morning. The house smelled of eggs and bacon. The 2 kids were in the living room, watching cartoons with a man who Short figured must be Linda's new husband, Steve. Short asked Steve to leave the kids and come into the kitchen with him and Linda because he needed to speak to both of them. Once all 3 of them had sat down at the kitchen table, Short got straight to the point. He broke the news that Keith had been murdered. And then Short watched as Linda's face crumpled and she literally collapsed into Steve's arms, sobbing. Short gave them a minute to compose themselves, but then he cut right to the chase. He asked where Linda and Steve had been at about 3 a.m., that morning. Linda seemed shocked to realize that the detective was considering both her and her husband as suspects. But through her tears, she choked out that they had both been at home, in bed with the kids, sleeping. Steve just nodded in agreement. He said they had all been home together all night long. That was it. Nothing about their demeanor or their reactions seemed overtly suspicious to Short. But when he pressed Linda about what her relationship with her ex-husband was like, she admitted that it was very contentious. She told him that just a couple of days earlier, she had spoken to a lawyer about potentially changing their custody agreement. Short found the timing of this to be a little too convenient. And he wondered, maybe Linda or Steve had decided that they would just settle the custody battle once and for all by simply taking Keith out of the picture for good. He also found it very convenient that Linda and Keith's two children happened to not be at Keith's house when the attack happened. It was only Anita's kids who were there at the time. But for now, Short thanked the couple for their time and told them he would be in touch if he had any more questions. Then he left their house. As he got into his car and drove back to the station, he kept going over the conversation in his mind. Linda and Steve's alibis were pretty weak. They were the only two people who could vouch for each other's whereabouts on the night of the murder. And what that meant was that Detective Short had every reason to keep both of them at the very top of his suspect list. Late that night, Short was sitting at his desk in his office when his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the police in Boise, Idaho. They had managed to track down Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Short immediately sat up straight in his chair and grabbed a pencil to take notes. The officer on the other end of the line told him that when they had first gotten to Luther's house, he wasn't there, but his fiancée, a woman named Connie, was. And she had told them that Luther had gone out on a weekend hunting trip. So the officers had gone out and searched for Luther in the area where he supposedly had been hunting, but they didn't find him. It wasn't until that evening that Luther actually arrived back at his house. The officer said that at that point they took him in for questioning, and he had told them the exact same story that Connie had, that he had been out elk hunting about an hour away from Boise all weekend. Luther had been able to describe basically every step of his hunting trip in great detail, but since he had been hunting alone, there was nobody who could corroborate his alibi. Now, Short knew that the drive from Boise, Idaho to Largo, Florida, where the attack took place, took at least 3 or 4 days. So, the fact that Luther was physically in Boise less than 24 hours after the murder meant that he could not possibly have driven there. But there was still a possibility that if he was involved, maybe he could have flown. Short knew it would be difficult, but not impossible, for Luther to catch a plane to Florida and back during the time that he was supposedly out hunting in the wilderness. So, he told the Boise officer to look into whether Luther had recently purchased an airline ticket and to also take saliva, blood, and hair samples from Luther for forensic analysis. After Short hung up the phone, he just sat back in his chair and thought for a second. It was less than 24 hours into this investigation, and he already had 3 prime suspects in his crosshairs: Keith's ex-wife Linda, Linda's new husband Steve, and also Anita's ex-husband Luther. And to some degree, Luther's fiancée Connie could have been involved, but based on the logistics and the fact that she was at the house when police arrived, it seemed unlikely. But there was one big problem. Based on the eyewitness testimony from both Anita and her son Jason, the suspect they were looking for was a dark-skinned man who Anita had never met before. And that description did not apply to any of their current suspects. Short knew that the suspect description might not be reliable. After all, it had been dark in the house, so Jason could have been wrong about the killer's skin color. And Anita was barely conscious during her brief interview, so her recollections might not be accurate at all. But if it was accurate, it could mean any number of things for his investigation. It could mean it was a random robbery after all, just some random person who broke into the house and did this horrible thing. It could also mean that one of his current suspects had maybe hired somebody to commit the crime. Or it could mean that all of Short's theories about the case were just completely wrong and he had no idea what had actually happened. Short rubbed his eyes and looked at the clock. He realized it was almost midnight. He decided it was time to go home and get some sleep. Maybe, he hoped, By morning, a new piece of evidence might turn up that would help point him in the right direction. Around 7 a.m. the next morning, about 28 hours after Keith's murder, Short pulled into the parking lot of Pinehurst Golf Course, which was located less than a mile away from Keith and Anita's house. And at this moment, Short was feeling really optimistic about the case because a groundskeeper at this very golf course had called the police that morning and said they had found a ski mask and a glove lying in the grass. So now, Short got out of his car and he went into the clubhouse. The groundskeeper was there waiting for him, and he said he had left the ski mask and the glove right outside exactly where he had found them. Short followed the groundskeeper out onto the course. As they walked, Short made a mental note of all the ponds scattered around the greens and also the large lake at the park right across the street. He wondered if maybe the killer might have tossed their weapon or weapons into one of these bodies of water. A minute later, the groundskeeper stopped walking and pointed down at the ground. There, lying in the grass, was a black ski mask and a dark-colored cotton glove exactly as promised. Short put on a pair of latex gloves and he knelt down. He carefully lifted up the mask. And as he did, he could feel that it was crusted with something reddish-brown, very likely dried blood. As soon as Short got back to the station, he sent the mask and the glove off to the crime lab for testing, hoping that they might find a trace of the killer's DNA. Then, Short spoke to his supervisor about sending a team of police divers out to search the water at the golf course and also at the park, just in case the murder weapons had been disposed of there. It seemed like a long shot that they would actually find something, but it was the best lead they had so far, and finding the weapon or weapons could really help them narrow down their suspect list. By the time Short got back to his desk, he saw that his answering machine was blinking. There was a new message. He hit play, and the message was from a man who said he had information on the Keith Young case. Short called him back right away. When the man answered, he said he was a college student who lived just a block away from Keith and Anita's house. And he said on the night of the murder, he and his friends had been hanging out in his driveway when they had seen a man jogging east down Coronet Avenue. Short immediately turned and looked at the map on his wall, and he got really excited because he saw that Coronet Avenue was the exact path the killer would have had to take to get from Keith and Anita's house to that golf course where the mask was found. Short asked the young man to describe this jogger. The college student said that it appeared to be a white man with short, dark hair. Short asked him if he was pretty sure about that, and the student said, yeah. In fact, the jogger had passed directly under a streetlight at one point, so they had all gotten a pretty good look at him. This was a huge development. Since 1-2-year-old Jason had said the killer had dark skin, it was very possible now that maybe Jason was wrong. But it was also possible that there were two men involved in the attack. Maybe one had dark skin and one had light skin. The following week, Short opened up a folder that had just been sent over from the police in Northport, Florida, a town about 85 miles away. On December 19th, just 4 days after Keith Young was murdered, a man and 3 kids in Northport had been shot to death in the middle of the night inside their home. The suspects in that attack were 2 men wearing ski masks, and they had also cut the house's phone lines. The similarities between these 2 killings were easy to see. But as far as Short could tell, the victims in the second attack didn't have any connections to the Youngs. Plus, the victims in that attack had been shot instead of stabbed. And so, as Short really did try to look for all the similarities he could between the 2 crime scenes, he just couldn't get over how blatantly personal the very violent and bloody attack at the Youngs' house had felt. So, even though there was this other on-the-surface similar killing in Florida, and even though Jason and Anita both swore they did not recognize the intruder, Short was not ready to rule out that Keith Young had been killed by someone who knew him. His strongest suspect was still Anita's ex-husband, Luther, who claimed to have been out hunting alone at the time of the attack. As for Anita, her condition had actually finally stabilized. And when Short had gone to speak to her at the hospital again, she had said that Luther was really the only person she could think of who might want to hurt her, because they had been arguing so much about custody and child support. But the Boise police had checked with every single airline in the country, and none of them had a record of Luther flying into Florida that weekend. So Short couldn't even prove that Luther was in the state at the time of the attack. And then Anita had also mentioned that she had been having problems with Keith's ex-wife, Linda. She said that Linda had been harassing her all summer long, calling her so many times that she couldn't even use her own phone. Short definitely still had his eye on Linda, but he still hadn't found anything that directly linked Linda or her new husband, Steve, to the crime. But Short was still very hopeful that this case would get solved, because a preliminary report from the forensics lab had just come in. It said that a single Caucasian hair had been discovered inside the black ski mask that was found on the golf course. This could point to any one of Short's main suspects. And Short knew it was only a matter of time before the forensics lab finished its full analysis of that hair sample, and then they would know for sure if it was an exact match. One day, in early January of 1992, a few weeks after Keith's murder, Detective Short got into the office and checked his answering machine. He found that he had gotten a message from the forensics lab telling him to call back right away. He picked up the phone and dialed the number, and he could feel his heart pounding as the line rang. This could finally be the break in the case he had been waiting for. When the technician picked up, he told Short that they had analyzed the hair found in the mask, and they had analyzed the DNA. But it was not a match for Short's top suspect, Anita's ex-husband, Luther. It was not a match. Short thanked the technician and hung up the phone, feeling incredibly disappointed. Now, this still didn't fully rule Luther out, especially because Short still thought there might have been two suspects involved. But he decided that at this point, it was time for investigators to really focus on other possibilities. Several weeks later, in early 1992, roughly a couple of months after Keith Young's murder, Detective Short knocked on the front door of Linda's house again. Linda is Keith's ex-wife. And when Linda opened the door and saw the detective once again standing outside her house, she quickly let him inside. The house was quiet, and Linda told Short that she was the only one home. They sat down in the living room, and they ran through all the subjects that Short had grilled her on the first time around: her alibi, her custody disputes, her tense relationship with Keith. And none of her answers changed, and she really didn't say anything that could be viewed as incriminating. But as their conversation began to wrap up, Linda looked anxious, like there was something more she wanted to say. Short asked her what was on her mind, and she said that there was something she hadn't mentioned when they had spoken the first time. It was about her new husband, Steve. She said that a while back, after she and Steve had gotten married, she had briefly rekindled her relationship with Keith. Steve had found out that she was cheating on him, and he was, naturally, very upset about it. Linda said that a few months ago, Steve had even made a few dark jokes about hurting Keith. At the time, she didn't think he was serious, but after Keith was killed, she started worrying that Steve might have somehow been involved. She said that she had even gone so far as to check Steve's knife collection to make sure none of them were missing. Short was careful not to let his shock come across on his face, but inside, his mind was absolutely spinning. He had always thought it was possible that Linda and Steve were both in on the murder, but now it sounded like maybe Steve might have acted alone. He also wondered, though, if Linda was just ratting out her husband to draw suspicion away from herself. So, to help get to the bottom of it, he asked Linda to come with him back to the station for a polygraph test. He also planned to order another polygraph for Steve, who was suddenly at the very top of his suspect list. But almost 2 months later, in March of 1992, Short was back in his office, staring down at a pile of documents he felt like he had already read over 1,000,000 times. And the evidence still didn't point him toward anybody in particular. Linda and Steve had both taken their polygraph tests, but the results did not indicate they were guilty. And there was still no hard evidence that tied either of them to the crime. Also, after searching all the ponds and the lake in the area, police still had not found a murder weapon. And they had still not been able to match that single strand of hair from the presumed killer's ski mask to any of the suspects on their radar. Short still had really 3 main suspects who could have been responsible for the murder. There was Keith's ex-wife Linda, who had been fighting with him about custody. Her alibi was weak and was only supported by her new husband, Steve, who she herself had become suspicious of. And so Steve was also one of his primary suspects, because he had this terrible history with Keith and had even openly joked about hurting him. And then there was Luther, Anita's hot-headed ex-husband who lived on the other side of the country. Now, it would have been possible for him to fly from Idaho to Florida and commit this crime, but there was no proof that he did. And of course, there was still the possibility that this was just a random attack or a robbery gone wrong, and investigators still couldn't even be sure if they were looking for one or two or more suspects. They had no idea. So Short had plenty of theories, but still no evidence to back any of them up. The investigation had gone so cold that the task force assigned to the case had been reduced from 5 detectives to just 2. Short was starting to fear that Keith's murder might never be solved. But just then, Short's phone rang. And when he picked up the receiver, a voice on the other end said that they knew something about that previous break-in attempt at Keith and Anita's house, the one that happened a few months before Keith's murder. And as Detective Short listened to what this caller had to say, he suddenly knew exactly who had broken into that house and killed Keith and tried to kill Anita. Based on all the collected evidence, as well as the killer's eventual partial confession, this is what investigators believe happened to Keith and Anita Young on the morning of the 15th of December, 1991. At 3 a.m., the killer saw that all the lights in Keith and Anita's house were dark. They carefully snuck around to the side of the home and cut the phone lines, just like they had done a few months before. The first time they'd been here, they had second-guessed themselves and didn't go through with what they had planned. But this time was going to be different. The killer broke into the house easily, feeling calm and in control. They had an axe in their right hand and a large knife in their left. As they made their way through the dark living room, they heard a sudden growling and hissing. They looked down to see the family's cat standing in their path, its back arched. They thought about strangling the cat to shut it up, but decided against it. They wanted to do this with as little collateral damage as possible. So they bent down and tried to soothe the cat. When it worked and the cat became quiet, the killer stepped past it and began walking down the hall. They made it to the master bedroom. They slowly opened the door and stepped inside. Anita and Keith were fast asleep in their bed. The killer quietly walked over to the side of the bed that Anita was on. They stood there, looking down at her, getting ready to do what they felt they had to do. But as the killer was looking down at Anita, she stirred in her sleep and her eyes fluttered open. For a brief second, she looked up and locked eyes with the killer standing over her. Then chaos erupted. They struggled and shoved each other, and their fight spilled out of the bedroom and into the main part of the house. This was not how the killer had hoped this would go. They had wanted to get this done quickly and quietly and leave without anybody waking up. But they had clearly underestimated Keith. He didn't stop fighting. And as the killer and Keith continued to stumble around and make their way back down the hallway, the killer suddenly felt something hard smash into the back of their skull. They turned to see Anita standing there behind them, blood running down her face and a baseball bat in her hands. The killer then heard Keith shout out for Anita to go get the gun, and he saw Anita run toward a nearby closet. At that same moment, the killer noticed a young boy looking out from a doorway nearby. And so the killer made a split-second decision. They just grabbed Keith and threw him with all their strength back into the master bedroom. And then the killer sprinted back down the hallway and out the front door. When they got to the sidewalk, they pulled off their ski mask and began to casually jog down the street, hoping that to anyone who might be looking outside their window, they would just look like an unassuming health nut out for a very early morning run. When they got to a nearby golf course, they stopped on the grass to change out of their bloody clothes. And after that, they stole a bicycle and rode away into the darkness. Things had not gone the way the killer had hoped. But as they reflected on what they had just done, they thought to themselves that, in reality, this actually could have gone much worse. They didn't kill the cat. And critically, no kids had been hurt, either. And in some ways, that's what this was all about, to avoid hurting the kids. Because the killer was Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass. He had wanted to get Anita out of the way so he could have full custody of their 4 children and treat them the way he believed they needed to be treated. He felt like she was screwing up their lives, that he was the kids' only solution. They needed him, and so he had to do this. But Luther's own fiancée, Connie, had ultimately been the one to call the Boise police. She told them that Luther was the one who had cut Keith and Anita's phone lines a few months back before the murder. And she said she knew Luther had actually flown to Florida on the weekend of the murder using an alias and a fake social security number that he had gotten from a coworker. Once the Boise police finished speaking with Connie, they immediately called Detective Short in Florida to tell him what they had just learned. It turned out there was no second suspect. It was just Luther all along. 12-year-old Jason had just been mistaken about the killer's appearance in the dark, and Anita had been wrong about not knowing who they were, likely due to her severe trauma, the darkness, and the mask. As for that single Caucasian hair that had been found inside the black ski mask that Luther had been wearing, it's unclear how it got there. It was not Luther's hair, but it's possible that maybe somebody else had put the mask on at some point before Luther stole or acquired it. Luther Bass was arrested in Boise, Idaho on the 6th of March 1992, and he confessed to the crime on the very same day. A year later, he was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary with an assault. He was sentenced to life, plus 30 years in prison. As for Anita, she would go on to make a recovery from her horrific injuries. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 25th of April 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were sitting in their police cruiser. They were parked in the lot of a public park in a city called Heilbronn in Germany. It was their lunch break. Martin was eating a sandwich, casually looking out across the park. The space was mostly empty, which made sense. It was a weekday afternoon, and most people were at work or school. Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and for the most part, it was a pretty safe place to live. The worst crimes they usually dealt with were things like break-ins or the occasional mugging. So, for Martin and his partner, it was a pretty quiet day. There wasn't a whole lot of action happening around them. But there was something that Martin, Michelle, and basically every other police officer in Germany were constantly aware of. For the past 14 years, a whole series of crimes had been happening all across the country. These crimes ranged from simple home invasions and robberies to at least 2 brutal murders. And according to the DNA evidence collected at each scene, they had all been committed by the same person. It was a single woman, and the press had given her a nickname. They called her the woman with no face. For over a decade, she had managed to evade capture. And so, in a way, every police officer in Germany was always on the lookout for her. She was the most elusive, most sought-after criminal in the entire country. But on this particular afternoon, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about the possibility of capturing the woman with no face. He was just thinking about his sandwich. He was about to take another bite when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the sound of the back doors of his cruiser opening. He whipped his head around to look, and what he saw sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. There were 2 people standing there, one at each of the open back doors, and each of them was holding a gun. Before Martin or Michelle could even process what was happening, before they could reach for their own weapons or even shout, the 2 people raised their guns. They fired. And for Martin, everything went black. Within minutes, the quiet park was swarming with police. Officers from the Heilbronn Police Department descended on the scene, their sirens cutting through the afternoon calm. They found Michelle first. She was deceased, killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. Then they saw Martin. He had also been shot in the head, but incredibly, he was still alive. He was unconscious, but breathing. An ambulance was called immediately, and paramedics rushed him to the hospital while detectives began the painstaking work of taping off the crime scene and looking for any piece of evidence they could find. Some of the officers started canvassing the area, going from bench to bench, path to path, hoping to find a witness. But it was no use. The park had been basically empty all day. There was nobody who had seen the shooting happen. Other officers got on their hands and knees, meticulously searching the ground around the police cruiser. They were looking for footprints, anything that might tell them which direction the shooters came from or where they went. They dusted the car for fingerprints, hoping for a stray print on a door handle or a window. They searched inside and outside the car for bullet casings, for hairs, for loose fibers from clothing, but there was nothing. It was as if the attackers had been ghosts. At this point, the investigators were completely stumped. All they knew for sure was that at least one shooter, maybe more, had managed to walk up to a marked police cruiser in broad daylight, completely undetected. They had opened the back doors, shot both officers in the head at point-blank range, and then vanished without leaving a single obvious trace behind. It seemed impossible. The investigators kept thinking they must have missed something. There had to be some small clue, something that could point them in the right direction, give them a lead on who was responsible for this brazen attack. In a last-ditch effort to find something, anything, at the crime scene, one of the forensic officers decided to swab the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. It was a long shot. They knew that if they found any DNA, it could easily belong to Martin or Michelle. Or it could belong to anyone else who had recently been in the back of that cruiser. It didn't mean the DNA would belong to the shooters. But it was possible. It was their only shot. They wouldn't know if the sample was useful until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that process could take a very long time. But it was worth a try. And so they carefully packaged the swabs and sent them off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come back, the Heilbronn Police Department continued to work the case. They re-interviewed everyone who worked in or lived near the park. They checked traffic cameras. They followed up on every tiny tip that came in. But they kept coming up empty. Their only real potential witness was Martin himself, but he was still in a deep coma at the hospital, unable to tell them what he saw. Weeks turned into a month. The case was growing colder by the day. And then, finally, the police got the news they had been waiting for. The DNA results from the lab were in. And what those results revealed was so stunning that it sent the media into an absolute frenzy and instantly turned this local investigation into a national manhunt. Around this same time, in mid-2007, a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Gunter Horn was sitting in his office. He got a call from his boss, and his boss's voice was urgent. He said, "The woman without a face has struck again." This time in Heilbronn. Gunter's eyes went wide. He sat up straight in his chair and listened intently as his boss laid out the details. 2 police officers had been ambushed in their cruiser. One was dead, the other in a coma. And in the back seat of their car, forensics had found DNA. The DNA of the woman with no face. Gunter had always been fascinated by this particular case. The story of the woman without a face was legendary in German law enforcement circles. And so, he was beyond ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Gunter, would be willing to lead the investigation into this latest crime in Heilbronn. His new mission was not just to solve the shooting of the 2 officers, but to finally, once and for all, identify and capture this phantom killer. Gunter immediately said yes. He would do it. And he got to work right away. The first thing Gunter did was organize a special task force to investigate the woman without a face. The team was based in Heilbronn, but their scope was national. At Gunter's command, detectives on the team began a massive undertaking. They started reinvestigating all the old crimes from all over Germany that had been linked to this woman's DNA. They were looking for patterns, for overlooked evidence, for witnesses that might have been missed during the original investigations years ago. Through this exhaustive effort, the team started to build a rough profile of their suspect. They knew she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had extensive criminal contacts. Many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But whenever police had managed to arrest and interrogate these co-conspirators, none of them would ever say a word about her. It was like they were terrified of her, loyal to her out of fear. There were a couple of other details that struck Gunter as being particularly odd. The first was the evidence itself. In 16 years of criminal activity, the only piece of evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of her dozens of crime scenes was her DNA. And since they didn't have a match for her in any database, they only knew she was a woman. They had no idea who she was. She had never left a single fingerprint. Not a footprint. Not a hair. Nothing else. It seemed like her crimes were incredibly deliberate, surgically clean, and meticulously planned. And yet, she was also consistently leaving behind her DNA. It was almost as if she was leaving it on purpose, like a calling card to taunt the police. The other strange thing Gunter and his task force discovered was that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses had described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. This was obviously weird. Based on the DNA evidence, they knew, unequivocally, that their suspect was biologically female. So Gunter had a couple of theories. Maybe this man seen at the crime scenes was just one of the woman's many co-conspirators. Or maybe the woman without a face was so cunning that she dressed as a man to avoid being identified and caught. But it was impossible to know for sure without a first-hand witness, someone who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Gunter really needed. And then, in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Gunter got a call about that exact type of witness he had been looking for. Later that same day, Gunter walked into a hospital in Heilbronn. He went to a specific room and saw police officer Martin Arnold lying in a hospital bed. His eyes were open. After being in a coma for a month, he had finally woken up. Gunter knew that Martin was his best, and maybe his only, chance of catching the woman without a face. Presumably, right before he was shot, he must have gotten a look at his attackers. He was the one witness who might finally be able to describe her. Gunter walked over, pulled up a chair next to Martin's hospital bed, and he gently asked him to please just tell him everything he remembered about what happened that day in the park. Martin was clearly distraught. He had just woken up from a coma to learn that his partner and friend, Michelle, was gone. He was emotional, trying to process his own injuries and her death, but he tried his best to help Gunter. He told him that, realistically, he couldn't remember what happened. He remembered hearing the doors open, turning around, seeing two figures. But after he was shot, it was like his memory of the event was just wiped clean. He had almost nothing to offer the investigation. And just like that, Gunter was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Gunter and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros. They clocked thousands upon thousands of hours of overtime. They even offered a massive reward equivalent to 400,000 American dollars for any information that could lead to her capture. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that while this massive investigation was going on, the woman without a face just kept committing crimes. The task force connected her DNA to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And her crimes weren't just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. The entire region was now on high alert for this woman who seemed to be an impossibly cunning international criminal genius. And Gunter, after all this time and all this effort, couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. The officer explained that the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. A badly burned body had been found, so disfigured that for a while all police knew was that the victim was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had recently come to France had been reported missing, and the police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on a hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork. That paperwork included his official fingerprints. The investigators had been able to lift a DNA profile from the ink on those prints, but when they got the DNA analyzed, the results made absolutely no sense. The French police were so baffled by what they found that they knew they had to call Gunter. They knew that if anyone in Europe needed to know about this bizarre DNA result, it was him. Gunter listened as the officer filled him in on the baffling results they had found. At first, he was just as confused as they were. But at the same time, he felt a new surge of hope. To him, it felt like, as bizarre as this new information was, maybe this was the break he had been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the clue that would finally allow him to figure out who this woman really was. He thanked the French police officer for the call and immediately brought this new information to his team. Within just a few days, this new information from France did in fact lead Gunter and his team directly to the woman with no face. It would turn out that this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across Germany and beyond, appeared to everyone who actually knew her as a completely normal person. No one would have ever suspected she was responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany. During the day, she worked at a factory. At night, she just went home. She lived a very ordinary, unremarkable life. And so, again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that the man's fingerprints on the paper somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. The man was biologically male, and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that for a fact. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman in disguise, that wasn't physically possible. And when the French police saw this impossible result, they knew they had to tell Gunter. When Gunter and his team looked into this, they finally figured out the shocking truth. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, and in particular her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police all over Europe used for DNA testing. On any given shift, this woman would touch hundreds, maybe even thousands of these swabs with her bare hands. And in doing so, she would accidentally leave microscopic traces of her own DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer. There was no brilliant female criminal mastermind parading around the country. There was just a massive, years-long contamination issue. Police had been using cotton swabs that were already contaminated with this factory worker's DNA. And so, in essence, the police had wasted nearly 2 decades of work, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime chasing a criminal who didn't even exist. It was later determined that the police officer, Martin Arnold, and his partner, Michel, were not attacked by some phantom killer. They were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders and serious crimes that had been attributed to the woman without a face over the years are still unsolved to this day, primarily because the police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest and most profound embarrassments in German police history. On the afternoon of the 2nd of May 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her small farmhouse. She was in a village called Bongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the entire day working outside on her farm under the hot sun. All she wanted to do was get some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a moment. But before she could even do that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the sound of that knock actually energized her. She was almost certain that her 16-year-old son, Bak Chang-soo, had finally come home. Soo-jin and her son ran the farm together, just the 2 of them. They barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So, to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town. He also frequently picked up odd jobs around the village for extra cash. The problem was, Chong-soo would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by the farmhouse to tell his mother where he was going first. And this was 1,930 inches rural Korea. It wasn't like he could just call her on the phone. And so, this meant his mother was left to worry about him pretty frequently. And for the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin had been doing. She had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he had gone for a few days at a time in the past, working these different odd jobs, a full week was a pretty long time for him to be gone without any word. But she kept telling herself what must have happened. He must have found some good work with a family who was having him live with them full time. It was probably a great opportunity, and he had taken it. Surely he would be home soon. And now, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was. So Soo-jin rushed to the front door. She pulled it open, but the hopeful smile on her face faded immediately. It was not her son standing on the doorstep. Instead, it was 2 police officers. The first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. Soo-jin told them that she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality was, she didn't know exactly where he was, and he had been gone for the past week. But she quickly added, "Don't worry, he isn't missing. He is very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he will be home soon." But after she said this, the police officers looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces. They told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief. They explained to her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy had been performed, and it showed he had been beaten and then strangled to death. For the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people, trying to figure out who this poor boy was. And based on everything they had learned so far, Soo-jin's son, Chong-soo, was the only teenager in the entire area who wasn't accounted for. Hearing all of this, Soo-jin simply could not believe it was true. Her son was a good boy. He stayed out of trouble and worked incredibly hard. She couldn't imagine why anyone in the world would want to hurt him. So, she just told the police this has to be a mistake, but the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come with them to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the 2 police officers. As they led her through the entrance, down a few long hallways, and towards the morgue, she kept telling herself over and over that her son was okay. He was still alive, and this was all just some kind of horrible, horrible mistake. It had to be. But the second she walked into the cold room of the morgue and saw the body lying on the metal table, her eyes welled up with tears. Because she knew, instantly, that it was her son. To Soo-jin, this moment felt like she had left real life and stepped into a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds. He was clearly decomposing. It was an awful, traumatic thing for a mother to see. But as she stood there, staring down at a parent's worst nightmare, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, this detail about the clothes felt very, very important. She started rattling off ideas for where they could have come from. It was like her brain had suddenly fixated on this one strange detail to avoid the overwhelming trauma of losing her son. She started telling the police that maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them. Or maybe he bought them without her knowing. Or maybe, she said, whoever killed him dressed him up in these clothes for some reason. But when she said that last part out loud, it was like the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her all at once. She started shaking uncontrollably, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her quiet farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking up the path towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case. She had just been at the farmhouse, all alone, trying to make sense of his violent death. But now, seeing the officers, she went right outside to meet them. She asked them, "Do you have news for me about what happened to my son?" And they told her that she would likely want to sit down to hear this. Sujin figured it couldn't possibly be worse than finding out your son has been murdered. So she said, "Okay, let's go inside." They all went inside the farmhouse and sat down. And then the police told her that they had figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not one, but two people in jail right now who had both given full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Sujin's son, Chong-soo, had worked with Wei at the inn in town. One of them was a young man, and one was a young woman. Apparently, Chong-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was secretly planning to run away with a different man from the village. And Chong-soo had told the married man about her plan. When the woman found out that Chong-soo had exposed her secret, she was furious. So furious, in fact, that she conspired with her male co-worker, the other suspect, to get revenge. They lured Chong-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then, when they got him out there, the man and the woman beat Chong-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the very first night that Chong-soo had left the farmhouse. So, over that 6-day period when his mother was worried, he was never living with another family and working for them. He was dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Sujin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all of this, Sujin still had one question. "What about my son's clothes?" she asked. Was there anything in the suspect's confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads no. They said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Sujin still felt deep down that the clothes had to mean something, she didn't argue. She didn't try to come up with other theories. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Sujin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to give him a proper burial in the local cemetery. And then, after that, she did her best to try to move on. But she never could. Every single night, she had the same terrible nightmare, replaying the moment she saw her son's body in the morgue. And as this nightmare kept happening, night after night, Sujin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. She basically stopped sleeping. She couldn't really eat. She certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She honestly began to think she was just going to wither away and die there unless something changed. She was overcome with grief and sadness, and she was also just plain scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then, on the night of the 18th of October, 1931, about 6 months after her son was killed, Sujin woke up from yet another nightmare. And when she opened her eyes, she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Sujin, she wasn't scared this time. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes. And she just began speaking to the figure. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Sujin really didn't know what she expected to happen when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have ever considered. Because suddenly, the ghost opened its mouth. And it spoke, and what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out that Chong-soo, Sujin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He had survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area. He was terrified that if he went back home, they would find him and finish the job. So, he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was essentially on the run. And for 6 months, he lived in random towns doing odd jobs just to survive. But eventually, after 6 months, he missed his mom. He missed his home. So he went back. And he walked into her room in the middle of the night. He was the ghost she saw at the foot of her bed. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just said to his mom, "I'm not dead." He was just being honest. He was there. He was back. He had survived. It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who, by the way, was never identified. He just happened to be in the same area where Chong-su had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chong-su immediately thought, "That's him. That was us." And so they confessed to killing him because that is what they had tried to do. They just didn't succeed. It was some other boy's body. And when Soo-jin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and badly bruised, and in her grief, it looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. Her intuition had fixated on his clothes, and she knew something was off. Well, she was right. It wasn't her son, and those were someone else's clothes. In the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chong-su had their murder charges dropped because they didn't actually commit a murder. They were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, that poor boy was never identified. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and over the years, the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so, even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we are not able to exhume his body because we don't know where he is. And so, it is very likely we will never know who that person was. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.